James Thornton stood before the full-length mirror in his penthouse suite, adjusting his tie with precision. The deep navy suit he had chosen complemented his sharp features and conveyed the image he wanted to project: wealth, power, and control. Tonight's gala was more than just a charity event. It was a stage to reinforce his status among the city's elite. And by his side would be Cassandra, his latest indulgence, a young and stunning woman whose presence alone could command attention. As he glanced at Cassandra seated on the chaise lounge, scrolling through her phone, James felt a surge of pride. She was wearing a form-fitting emerald gown that shimmered under the soft light, her blonde curls cascading over her shoulders. To James, she was a symbol of everything he had worked for: success, luxury, and the freedom to have what he wanted. Cassandra looked up and smiled, her youthful charm disarming. "Do you think I'll make an impression tonight?" she teased. "You'll do more than that," James replied, his tone confident. "You'll leave them speechless." The limousine ride to the venue was filled with idle chatter about the attendees and the event's significance. The annual charity gala was a prestigious affair, hosted at the sprawling Rosewood Hotel ballroom, known for its grandeur and exclusivity. The who's who of the business world would be present, and James relished the opportunity to showcase not only his wealth, but also his new life, free from the confines of his marriage. When they arrived, the valet opened the door, and cameras immediately began flashing. James stepped out first, adjusting his jacket, before offering his hand to Cassandra. As she emerged, the crowd of photographers and onlookers turned their lenses toward her, captivated by her beauty. James felt a wave of satisfaction as whispers rippled through the small crowd gathered outside the entrance. He could already hear the murmurs. "Who's the blonde? Is she with Thornton?" Inside the grand ballroom, crystal chandeliers bathed the space in a warm glow, and the sound of a live string quartet filled the air. Waiters in crisp uniforms glided between clusters of guests, offering trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. James walked in with Cassandra on his arm, drawing glances from every corner of the room. Some were admiring, others curious, and a few judgmental. James noticed them all but dismissed the latter with a practiced indifference. He had no time for naysayers tonight. As they made their way through the crowd, James greeted several business associates, his charisma on full display. He introduced Cassandra with a confident smile, presenting her as a companion who shared his enthusiasm for philanthropy. Cassandra played her part well, smiling demurely and making small talk with the grace of someone trying to fit into a world she didn't quite belong to. "James, you never fail to make an entrance," remarked Harold Grayson, a prominent real estate mogul, as he shook James's hand. His tone was jovial, but there was a subtle edge to his words, a hint of disapproval masked by politeness. "And who might this lovely lady be?" "This is Cassandra," James replied smoothly. "She's been an incredible source of inspiration lately." "Inspiration indeed," Harold said, his smile tight. His gaze lingered on Cassandra for a moment before shifting back to James. "I must say, you're full of surprises." As Harold walked away, James felt a flicker of unease, but he quickly pushed it aside. The night was about appearances, and he was determined to control the narrative. Cassandra, meanwhile, began to feel the weight of the stares and whispers around her. She leaned closer to James and whispered, "Everyone's looking at me." "They're supposed to," James said, his tone firm but reassuring. "That's the point." But not all the attention was welcome. Across the room, a few familiar faces exchanged knowing glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity and judgment. James caught snippets of hushed conversations. "Where's Amara? Isn't she usually with him at these events? And I heard they're having issues." The evening progressed with toasts and speeches, each more pretentious than the last. James enjoyed every moment, sipping champagne and basking in the glow of his own importance. Cassandra did her best to keep up, though it was clear she felt out of place among the seasoned elites. James noticed, but didn't care. She was there to serve a purpose, and her discomfort didn't factor into his plans. As the auction began, James prepared to make a show of his wealth, planning to bid generously on a few high-profile items. He knew the eyes of the room were on him, and he relished the opportunity to reinforce his status. Cassandra clung to his arm, her smile more forced now, but James barely noticed. He was too absorbed in the role he had crafted for himself. Unbeknownst to him, the carefully curated image he had built was about to crumble. A storm was brewing, and its arrival would change everything. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, the grand ballroom buzzed with energy as the auctioneer took the stage. James Thornton, glass of champagne in hand, smirked confidently at Cassandra, whose attempts at small talk with nearby guests had fizzled into polite nods. He relished his dominance here, a king among his peers, until the faint rustle of whispers began sweeping through the crowd like an uninvited chill. Heads turned toward the entrance. The room, lively and buzzing just moments before, seemed to pause, its collective gaze fixed on the woman stepping into the light. Amara Thornton stood tall, framed by the ballroom's ornate double doors. She wore a deep burgundy gown that hugged her figure with understated elegance, her natural beauty illuminated by her calm confidence. Her dark skin glowed under the chandeliers, her chin lifted as if daring anyone to meet her gaze. It wasn't just the dress or the jewelry that silenced the room. It was her presence, an undeniable blend of dignity and quiet power. James felt the blood drain from his face. His confident smirk faltered, replaced by a stiffness that even Cassandra noticed. "Who is that?" she whispered, oblivious to the tension radiating from James. "That's my wife," he muttered, the words barely audible, as if saying them aloud might solidify Amara's dominance in the moment. His grip on his champagne flute tightened. Amara moved further into the room, every step deliberate. She wasn't here for idle gossip or charity theatrics. Her eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on James. A faint smile played on her lips, one that wasn't warm but wasn't confrontational either. It was the kind of smile that unsettled, a subtle reminder of everything James had underestimated. The whispers grew louder. "She looks incredible," someone murmured. "Isn't that Thornton's wife? I thought they separated. God, the way she carries herself. That's class." James's ears burned. The control he'd been so sure of was slipping. Cassandra clung to his arm, confused but now visibly uneasy. The charm she'd relied on all evening seemed to evaporate in Amara's shadow. Amara greeted familiar faces with a warm nod or brief handshake, exuding the kind of charisma that didn't need loud laughter or false flattery to be felt. She didn't rush toward James. She let the distance remain, as if silently forcing him to come to her. Eventually, she stopped near a group of influential businesswomen who welcomed her like an old friend. She laughed lightly at something one of them said, her voice carrying across the room, melodious but sharp enough to cut through the air. James stared, unable to pull his eyes away. It wasn't just her beauty. It was the control she commanded, a stark contrast to the forced poise Cassandra had been struggling to maintain all night. Finally, Amara's gaze shifted fully to James, and with it, the weight of the room seemed to collapse onto his shoulders. Her smile widened slightly, but there was no warmth in it now. It was a challenge, a silent acknowledgement of the power she held. "Should we leave?" Cassandra whispered, sensing the imbalance in the room, but not understanding its full depth. "No," James snapped, his voice a shade too loud. The sound drew even more attention, leaving him exposed. "We're not going anywhere." Amara began making her way toward them, unhurried. Each step felt like a countdown, her heels clicking against the marble floor, reverberating in James's chest. When she finally stopped a few feet away, her smile remained, but her eyes cut through him like steel. "James," she said, her tone smooth and unreadable. She turned her attention to Cassandra without missing a beat. "And who might this be?" James opened his mouth to respond, but Cassandra beat him to it, awkwardly extending her hand. "I'm Cassandra," she stammered. "James's friend." Amara's eyebrows raised just slightly. "A friend," she echoed, her voice carrying a note of amusement that sent a ripple through the surrounding guests, who had shamelessly begun to gather closer. James cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. "Amara," he started, but she silenced him with a look. "Let's not spoil the evening," she said lightly, turning back to the crowd. It's for a good cause, after all. With that, she walked away, leaving James frozen in place, Cassandra visibly shrinking beside him. The murmurs rose again, louder this time, their words circling James like vultures. For the first time in years, James Thornton felt small. As Amara joined another group across the room, her laughter ringing clear, James realized this wasn't just an entrance. This was a reckoning, and Amara had come prepared. As Amara moved gracefully through the ballroom, exchanging smiles and polite nods with guests, James's mind couldn't help but wander back to the life they had shared. Each glance she cast his way, cool, composed, unflinching, seemed to carry 1,000 unspoken words. And with every look, memories he had tried to bury came rushing back. Years ago, when they first met, James was a struggling entrepreneur with little more than a big idea and a pile of debt. Amara had been his rock, a brilliant and driven woman who believed in him when no one else did. They met at a networking event for small business owners, where Amara, already climbing the corporate ladder, stood out with her sharp insights and undeniable charm. James had been instantly captivated, and over time, her belief in him became the fuel he needed to keep going. In the early days, they were inseparable, working late nights together, brainstorming strategies and scraping by on takeout dinners. Amara, with her background in finance, had helped James structure his fledgling company, making sense of the chaos he thrived in but couldn't manage alone. When the banks refused him loans, it was Amara who found creative ways to secure funding. She even dipped into her own savings to cover payroll during one particularly rough quarter. But it wasn't just her practical support that had been critical. Amara's unwavering belief in James had given him a sense of purpose, a confidence he hadn't known he possessed. She celebrated every small victory as if it were a monumental achievement, lifting him up when doubt threatened to drag him down. Their love had been passionate and all-consuming in those days. Amara was James's equal in every sense, his partner, his confidant, and the person he turned to when the pressure felt unbearable. She was the one who steadied him when deals fell through, who reminded him why he started in the first place. But as the years passed and the business grew, so did James's ego. Success, once so elusive, became intoxicating. The long hours they had spent working side by side were replaced by late nights at exclusive parties and business trips where Amara was no longer invited. She had initially dismissed these changes as the natural evolution of their lives. James was a CEO now, and with that came new responsibilities. But soon, his focus on their shared dream began to blur, replaced by a fixation on status and appearances. Amara's sacrifices only grew. She gave up a promising promotion at her firm to focus on supporting James full-time, believing that their partnership would always be stronger than any individual achievement. But the more she gave, the more distant he became. Arguments erupted over his constant absences, his growing need to impress people who didn't matter, and his increasingly dismissive attitude toward her contributions. One night stood out more than the rest, a pivotal moment Amara would never forget. They were sitting in their living room, the soft glow of the fireplace doing little to soften the tension between them. Amara had just finished reviewing a proposal James's team had sent over, pointing out critical flaws that could cost the company millions. When she handed it to him, expecting a grateful acknowledgement, James barely glanced at it before saying, "I've got people for that now, Amara. You don't have to stress over these things anymore." The words hit her like a slap. After everything she had done, the countless hours she had poured into building the business with him, James had relegated her to the sidelines. That was the moment she realized he no longer saw her as a partner. She wasn't his equal anymore. She was an afterthought. Then came the final blow, the whispers of his affair. At first, Amara refused to believe them. James had flaws, but infidelity wasn't one of them. At least, that's what she told herself. But the signs became impossible to ignore. The unexplained late nights, the vague excuses, the new cologne he started wearing without mentioning it. When she confronted him, he denied it, but the defensiveness in his tone spoke louder than his words. Standing in the ballroom now, Amara's mind lingered on those moments of betrayal. But rather than bitterness, she felt a quiet strength. She had endured the pain, the humiliation, and the doubts about her worth, and yet here she was, standing tall, radiant, and unapologetically herself. James, on the other hand, felt the weight of these memories as a suffocating presence. He glanced at Amara across the room, laughing with a group of influential guests, and couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. He had been so consumed by the image of success that he hadn't realized what he was losing until it was gone. Cassandra's voice pulled him out of his thoughts. "Are you okay? You've been quiet." James forced a smile, but his mind remained elsewhere. No matter how much he tried to shake it, the memories of Amara's sacrifices and his own failings clung to him like a shadow, refusing to let him go. Tonight, he realized, wasn't just another gala. It was a reckoning. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, Cassandra fidgeted with the delicate hem of her emerald gown, her nerves no longer masked by the polished smile she had worn all evening. The grandeur of the ballroom, with its glittering chandeliers and air thick with wealth and influence, no longer felt intoxicating. Instead, it felt suffocating. She had spent the night on James Thornton's arm, basking in his compliments and the attention of those who envied her position. But now, she felt exposed, as though the spotlight that had once seemed flattering was now a glaring interrogation light. The arrival of Amara had shifted everything. Cassandra could feel it in the way the crowd's energy changed, the way conversations tapered off when Amara walked by, only to pick up again with whispers in her wake. Cassandra hated the whispers. She couldn't quite make out the words, but she knew she was at the center of them. The way people looked at her, some with pity, others with thinly veiled disdain, only confirmed it. She felt like a cheap imitation standing in the shadow of Amara's elegance. No amount of designer fabric or borrowed confidence could compete with the effortless grace that Amara exuded. Cassandra had tried to dismiss her discomfort earlier in the night, convincing herself that she deserved to be here, that James had chosen her for a reason. But now, watching Amara move through the room like she belonged, Cassandra couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that she was out of her depth. "Cassandra, you're quiet," James said, his voice sharp enough to startle her. She looked up to find him watching her, his usual air of control strained. His gaze flickered between her and Amara across the room, though he tried to hide it. "I'm fine," she replied, forcing a smile. But she wasn't. She felt as though every eye in the room was on her, judging her. Cassandra wasn't naive. She knew what people thought. They saw her as a trophy, a distraction, someone James had plucked from obscurity to satisfy his ego. And maybe they weren't wrong. She hadn't always been this person. Before James, Cassandra had been a makeup artist, working long hours to make ends meet. She had dreams once, ambitions to start her own beauty brand, to make something of herself. But those dreams had felt far away, and when James swept into her life with promises of luxury and comfort, she hadn't hesitated. He had made her feel special, important, like she was finally seen. But tonight, she felt invisible, or worse, like she was a joke. Cassandra glanced around the room, her discomfort growing with each passing moment. Every conversation seemed to orbit around Amara, her name slipping into sentences with admiration and curiosity. "Amara Thornton looks stunning, doesn't she? Did you hear about the time she negotiated that merger for James's company? She's so much more than a wife. She's a force." The compliment stung, though Cassandra couldn't fully understand why. Jealousy, perhaps? Or maybe it was the realization that James's world would always belong to Amara, no matter how much he tried to replace her. James, for his part, seemed distracted, his confident facade cracking. He was watching Amara too, and Cassandra couldn't ignore the way his expression softened when he looked at her. It was a look he had never given Cassandra, not even in their most intimate moments. It wasn't lust or admiration. It was something deeper, something that made Cassandra feel like an outsider. "Do you want another drink?" Cassandra asked, desperate to break the silence between them. James shook his head, barely acknowledging her. She set her empty champagne glass on a passing waiter's tray, her hands trembling slightly. The night dragged on, each moment more excruciating than the last. Cassandra tried to engage with the guests, to remind herself why she was here. but the responses were clipped and dismissive. No one wanted to talk to her. They were too busy vying for Amara's attention. Finally, unable to bear the weight of the room any longer, Cassandra excused herself and slipped out onto the balcony. The cool night air was a relief against her flushed skin. She gripped the railing tightly, staring out at the city lights, her mind racing. For the first time since meeting James, she questioned her choices. Was this what she wanted? To be paraded around as a symbol of someone else's success, only to be discarded when she no longer served her purpose? She had thought being with James would elevate her, but tonight had shown her the truth. She wasn't an equal partner. She was a decoration, replaceable and insignificant. The door to the balcony opened, and Cassandra turned, half expecting James. But it was one of the guests, an older woman with a kind face. "Are you all right, dear?" the woman asked, her voice gentle but probing. "I'm fine," Cassandra replied automatically, though the words felt hollow. The woman studied her for a moment before offering a small smile. "You don't look fine, but don't worry. It gets easier." Cassandra frowned. "What is?" "Realizing your worth," the woman said simply, "and knowing when to walk away." Cassandra watched as the woman disappeared back into the ballroom, her words lingering like an echo. She turned back to the city skyline, her chest tightening. For the first time, Cassandra allowed herself to imagine a life without James. A life where she was more than an accessory, more than a fleeting choice. And for the first time, it didn't seem so impossible. The hum of anticipation filled the grand ballroom as the auction began. The auctioneer, an older man with a booming voice and a theatrical presence, stepped up to the podium, commanding the attention of the room. The items on display ranged from exclusive art pieces to luxury vacations, each more extravagant than the last. It was the kind of spectacle that allowed the wealthy to flaunt their riches under the guise of charity. James Thornton positioned himself near the center of the room, a place of strategic importance where his every move would be noticed. Cassandra clung to his arm, though her earlier enthusiasm had waned into a quiet, strained presence. James, however, was determined to make his mark. Tonight, he would outbid anyone, make the largest donations, and prove to everyone, Amara included, that he was still the man everyone admired. Amara, meanwhile, stood at the edge of the crowd, her expression calm but observant. She wasn't interested in the gaudy display of wealth unfolding before her. What intrigued her was the subtle dynamics of the room. The way people avoided eye contact with James, the furtive glances in her direction, the whispers that followed her every step. She knew exactly what was happening. The room wasn't just watching the auction, it was watching her. The auctioneer held up the next item, a custom-made luxury yacht, its sleek design projected on a screen for all to admire. "We'll start the bidding at $200,000, the auctioneer declared, his voice echoing through the room. James didn't hesitate. $300,000, he announced, his voice loud and confident. Heads turned, and a ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd. $350,000, came another voice from the back, a rival businessman James had clashed with in the past. The bidding war began, each offer climbing higher, the stakes escalating. James smirked, raising his hand again. $450,000. The auctioneer grinned. "We have $450,000. Do I hear 500?" Amara watched the exchange with a detached curiosity. She knew James well enough to recognize the performance. This wasn't about the yacht or the charity. It was about power, about proving that he could outshine anyone, including her. She allowed herself a faint smile. If James wanted to play games, she would let him for now. The bidding continued to climb, with James leading the charge. Cassandra clapped politely, though the tension in her posture betrayed her unease. At $750,000, James stood victorious, his smug grin plastered across his face as the auctioneer declared him the winner. The room erupted in applause, though it felt more polite than genuine. James leaned over to Cassandra, whispering, "See, that's how it's done." But before he could revel in his triumph, the auctioneer introduced the next item, an exclusive piece of jewelry, a necklace adorned with rare, ethically sourced gemstones. The piece was exquisite, elegant without being ostentatious, and it immediately captured the room's attention. "We'll start the bidding at $150,000, the auctioneer announced. James, eager to continue his streak, raised his hand. $200,000. The crowd stirred, and the auctioneer nodded. $200,000 from Mr. Thornton. Do I hear 250? $300,000, came a voice from across the room. A woman's voice. The crowd turned in unison to see Amara, her hand raised, her expression serene. The silence that followed was almost deafening. James froze, his smirk fading as his eyes locked on Amara. She met his gaze with quiet defiance, her poise unshaken. The auctioneer recovered quickly. $300,000 from Mrs. Thornton. $350. James interrupted, his voice sharper now. Amara raised an eyebrow, then calmly lifted her hand again. $400. The crowd gasped. All eyes were now on the two of them, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. James's face reddened, and Cassandra shifted uncomfortably beside him, sensing that this was no longer about the auction. $450, James snapped. Amara tilted her head, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. $500. The room buzzed with whispers. The stakes had shifted. This wasn't just a bid. It was a battle. James hesitated, his jaw tightening. The crowd watched, waiting for his next move, but he remained silent. Amara's gaze didn't waver, her calm composure in stark contrast to James's visible frustration. The auctioneer, sensing the climax, declared, $500,000 to Mrs. Thornton. Going once, going twice. Sold. The room erupted into applause, this time genuine and filled with admiration. Amara nodded graciously, as though she had simply done what was expected of her. James, on the other hand, stood rigid, his fists clenched at his sides. As Amara moved forward to finalize the bid, the crowd parted for her, their expressions a mix of awe and respect. James watched, seething, as she accepted the congratulations with effortless grace. She didn't look back at him, but she didn't need to. Her actions spoke louder than words. For the rest of the auction, James remained quiet, his earlier bravado replaced by a simmering anger. Cassandra, sensing his mood, stayed silent, unsure of what to say. Across the room, Amara mingled with the guests, her laughter and easy charm filling the space James once dominated. By the time the auction ended, it was clear to everyone, Amara Thornton was the true star of the evening, and James, for all his wealth and power, had been thoroughly outshined. The ballroom had begun to thin out as the night wore on, but James Thornton barely noticed. He stood near the bar, nursing a glass of whiskey, his jaw clenched so tightly it felt like it might snap. His earlier confidence had crumbled, leaving behind a simmering mix of frustration, humiliation, and something he couldn't quite name. Guilt, perhaps. Amara had outmaneuvered him in every way tonight. The crowd had gravitated toward her like moths to a flame, leaving him to stew in the shadow of her elegance and poise. Even Cassandra, standing quietly by his side, seemed to shrink further into the background, her presence more of an irritation now than a comfort. "James," a familiar voice said, soft yet firm. He turned sharply to find Amara standing a few feet away, her expression calm but unreadable. The way she held herself, with quiet authority, made him feel suddenly small, a sensation he wasn't used to. "Amara," he said, his voice a touch too loud in the otherwise quiet space. He cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. "Enjoying the attention, are we?" She tilted her head, her lips curving into a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I think you've had enough of that for one night." Cassandra shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension but unsure of her place in this dynamic. Before she could say anything, Amara's gaze flicked to her, a subtle but unmistakable dismissal. "This is between James and me," Amara said, her tone polite but firm. Cassandra hesitated, looking to James for guidance, but he avoided her eyes. Flustered, she muttered something about needing air and quickly left, leaving James and Amara alone. Amara stepped closer, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. James straightened, instinctively trying to regain some semblance of control, but it was clear she had the upper hand. She always had, he realized, even when he'd convinced himself otherwise. "I didn't expect you to come tonight," he said, breaking the silence. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm sure you didn't. You've made it clear you'd rather I stay out of sight." She paused, her voice steady but laced with quiet anger. "But I decided I'd had enough of hiding." James let out a sharp breath, his frustration bubbling over. "Is that what this is about? You came here to humiliate me?" Amara's laugh was soft but cutting. "Humiliate you? No, James. You did that to yourself." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He turned away, staring down at his drink, as if the amber liquid might offer some kind of escape. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under. The expectations, the constant scrutiny." "Don't," Amara interrupted, her voice sharp. "Don't you dare make this about your pressures. Do you think I didn't feel the weight of it too? Do you think I didn't sacrifice just as much, if not more?" Her words hung heavy in the air. James turned back to her, meeting her gaze for the first time that night. There was no anger there, only disappointment, and somehow that was worse. "I believed in you," she continued, her tone softening but losing none of its power. "When no one else did. I stood by you when you had nothing, James. I gave up my own dreams to build yours. And this," she gestured vaguely toward the emptying ballroom, "this is how you repay me? By parading someone half my age in front of everyone who knows us." James flinched but didn't respond. What could he say? She was right, and they both knew it. Amara sighed, the weight of years of resentment and heartbreak pressing down on her. "Do you even see what you've become? The man I fell in love with. He was ambitious, yes, but he had integrity. He cared about more than just appearances and status. I don't know who this man is standing in front of me, but he's not the James Thornton I believed in." Her words felt like a knife twisting in his chest. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the truth was undeniable. Somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of everything that mattered. "I never meant to hurt you," he said quietly, the admission tasting bitter on his tongue. Amara shook her head, a sad smile playing on her lips. "Intentions mean nothing without actions, James. And your actions made it clear where I stand in your life. Or rather, where I don't." The finality in her voice sent a wave of panic through him. "Amara, please," he began, his voice cracking. "We can fix this. I'll change. I'll." She held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "This isn't about you fixing anything, James. This is about me finally realizing I deserve better. Better than lies, better than being an afterthought, better than you." Her words hung in the air like a gavel striking down. James stared at her, speechless, as the reality of her words settled over him. She wasn't angry. She wasn't trying to hurt him. She was simply done. Amara turned to leave, her movements slow and deliberate, as if giving him one last chance to say something that might change her mind. But he couldn't find the words. For the first time in his life, James Thornton, the man who always had a quick answer, was silent. As she walked away, James felt the weight of his choices crushing him. The woman who had built him up, who had been his anchor in the storm, was gone. And deep down, he knew he had no one to blame but himself. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, Amara Thornton stepped out into the crisp morning air, the sunlight warming her skin as she took a deep breath. It had been weeks since the gala, and the whirlwind of emotions from that night had finally begun to settle. She no longer felt the sting of betrayal or the weight of disappointment. Instead, she felt a clarity and calm she hadn't experienced in years. It was the beginning of something new, a life she was building for herself, on her terms. After filing for divorce, Amara had wasted no time reclaiming her independence. She moved out of the sprawling house she had shared with James and into a modern, sunlit apartment overlooking the city. It wasn't as grand as their home, but it was hers, a space free from the ghosts of their fractured marriage. The first night there, she had slept soundly for the first time in years. The silence no longer a reminder of James's absence, but a comforting symbol of her newfound peace. Amara threw herself into her work, revisiting dreams she had shelved to support James. She reached out to old colleagues, rekindling connections she had let fade over time. To her surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. People respected her intelligence and tenacity, remembering her as the woman who had quietly steered James Thornton's empire to success while remaining in the background. Several offers came her way, from consulting gigs to executive roles, but Amara had something else in mind. The idea had struck her the morning after the gala, as she stood on her apartment balcony, sipping coffee and reflecting on the path that had brought her here. She thought of the countless women like her, intelligent, capable, and full of potential, who had sacrificed their dreams for relationships, only to be left undervalued and overlooked. She thought of the strength it took to walk away, to rebuild a life from the ground up, and how often society underestimated that strength. By the time she finished her coffee, the vision was clear. She would create a non-profit organization dedicated to empowering women in similar situations. It would offer career counseling, financial planning, and legal resources for those navigating divorce or starting over. It would be a place where women could find support, regain their confidence, and remember their worth. The weeks that followed were a blur of planning and meetings. Amara reached out to contacts she hadn't spoken to in years, pitching her idea with a passion that reignited old alliances. Donations poured in, some from women who had been inspired by her story after hearing whispers of her confrontation with James at the gala. Even a few men, moved by the quiet dignity with which she had handled herself, contributed generously, acknowledging the importance of her mission. One of her first hires was a financial advisor who had worked with her years ago during the early days of James's company. The woman, a single mother who had faced her own struggles, was thrilled to join Amara's team. Together, they began laying the groundwork for the nonprofit, turning Amara's vision into a reality. By the time the nonprofit's launch event arrived, Amara stood before the crowd with a confidence that came not from validation, but from within. The room was filled with supporters, friends, colleagues, and women who had already benefited from the organization's pilot programs. The atmosphere buzzed with hope and possibility. Dressed in a sleek, tailored jumpsuit, Amara stepped up to the podium. She looked out at the sea of faces, her heart swelling with gratitude and purpose. For a moment, she thought about James, not with bitterness, but with the quiet acknowledgement that his betrayal had been the catalyst for her transformation. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady and warm. "Tonight is about new beginnings. It's about recognizing the strength within ourselves to rise, even when the world tells us to stay down. It's about reclaiming our power and building a future where we no longer wait for permission to thrive." The applause that followed was thunderous, filling the room with energy. Amara smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what she had been meant to do all along. Not stand in someone else's shadow, but create a legacy of her own. As the evening continued, Amara mingled with the guests, hearing stories of resilience and hope from the women she had already helped. One woman, a young mother of 3, tearfully thanked her for providing the resources she needed to escape an abusive marriage and start her own small business. Another spoke about how Amara's nonprofit had given her the tools to pursue a career in tech after years of feeling trapped in a dead-end job. Amara's heart swelled with pride. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the countless lives she was helping transform. Every story she heard was a testament to the power of community, resilience, and self-belief. That night, as the event wound down and the guests began to leave, Amara stood alone by the windows, looking out at the city lights. For the first time in years, she felt truly free. The weight of her past was no longer a burden. It was a foundation, a reminder of how far she had come and how much further she could go. She thought back to the version of herself who had stood by James all those years, sacrificing her own dreams for his. That woman was gone, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and unshakably confident. Amara Thornton wasn't just starting over. She was finally living the life she had always deserved. James Thornton sat alone in his expansive office, the city skyline stretching out before him through floor to ceiling windows. The view that once symbolized his success now felt like a cage, trapping him in the opulence he had built but couldn't enjoy. The gala's events replayed in his mind, each memory a dagger that deepened his sense of loss and regret. In the weeks following the confrontation, James tried to maintain his usual routine, but everything felt off kilter. His mornings began late, skipping the meticulous preparation he once relished. Meetings that were once invigorating now felt burdensome, and his usual charm seemed to have deserted him. Employees noticed his distracted demeanor, whispers of uncertainty spreading through the office like a slow-burning fire. James's phone rang incessantly, but he struggled to muster the energy to respond. Calls from business partners were met with vague promises and half-hearted reassurances. Deals that once came easily were now stalled, partners hesitant to align themselves with a man whose reputation was beginning to crumble. The boardroom, once his arena, became a place of isolation rather than influence. His decisions, previously sharp and confident, were now clouded by doubt and second-guessing. At home, the mansion felt unbearably silent. The rooms echoed with the absence of Amara's presence, her departure leaving a void that no amount of wealth could fill. James wandered through the halls, touching surfaces and memories, seeking solace in the familiarity that only deepened his sense of emptiness. He had surrounded himself with luxury, but without Amara, it felt hollow and meaningless. Social engagements became a chore rather than an opportunity. Invitations to exclusive events dwindled as whispers about his personal life overshadowed his professional achievements. When he did attend gatherings, the once enthusiastic greetings were now polite but distant, conversations skirting around the real issues. Friends who had once admired his drive and success began to distance themselves, unsure of how to navigate the shifting dynamics. James's nights were the hardest. He found himself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by memories of what he had lost. The image of Amara walking away replayed endlessly, her strength and grace a stark contrast to his own unraveling composure. He replayed their conversations, the way she had spoken with such clarity and conviction, and felt the weight of his failures pressing down on him. Desperate to regain some sense of control, James threw himself into work, hoping that busyness would drown out his pain. But the more he worked, the more he realized how little joy he derived from it without Amara's partnership. His efforts were met with diminishing returns, projects faltering under his distracted leadership. The company, once a testament to their combined efforts, began to show cracks that were impossible to ignore. Personal relationships suffered as well. Friends who had once been pillars of support now seemed distant, their interactions strained by his inability to engage fully. Romantic interests found his mood swings and increasing reclusiveness difficult to handle, further isolating him. The once vibrant social life he had cultivated now felt like a series of hollow interactions, each one a reminder of his growing emptiness. James sought solace in his hobbies, but even they no longer provided the escape they once did. Golf outings felt pointless without Amara's laughter beside him, and dinners at his favorite restaurants were marred by his inability to enjoy the meal or the company. He missed the way she had brought light into every aspect of his life, her presence a source of comfort and inspiration that he had taken for granted. In a moment of rare vulnerability, James visited the gym, a place he had always gone to blow off steam. As he lifted weights, he felt the physical strain mirroring his internal turmoil. Sweat dripped down his face, each drop a tangible manifestation of his frustration and sorrow. He glanced around, noticing how others seemed unaffected by their own struggles, and felt a profound sense of alienation. One evening, unable to bear the solitude any longer, James found himself wandering the city streets. The bright lights and bustling crowd should have been comforting, but instead, they highlighted his loneliness. He ended up at a small, quiet park, sitting on a bench under a lone street lamp. The cool night air did little to soothe his restless mind. He stared at the stars, searching for answers that never came. In these moments of introspection, James began to realize the depth of his mistakes. He had sacrificed the most important person in his life for the sake of image and control, and now he was paying the price. The realization was painful, but it also ignited a flicker of determination within him. He couldn't undo the past, but perhaps he could find a way to rebuild. not for his reputation or his business, but for himself. Yet, the path forward was unclear. The damage was extensive, both personally and professionally. Trust had been broken, and rebuilding it would require more than just effort. It would demand genuine change and humility. James knew he had a long road ahead, one fraught with challenges and the need for self-forgiveness. As he sat there, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him, James made a silent promise. He would strive to become a better man, to learn from his failures, and to honor the legacy of what he and Amara had built together. It was a small step, but it was the beginning of his slow and painful journey toward redemption. With a deep breath, James stood up, feeling the cold night air invigorate him slightly. He walked away from the bench, each step a reminder of the distance he still had to travel. The city lights seemed a little brighter, the night a little quieter, as he embarked on the hardest battle of his life, the fight to reclaim his integrity and find peace within himself. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, the grand ballroom was bathed in warm light, the air filled with an electric buzz of excitement. Amara Thornton stood at the front, poised and confident, as she looked out over the crowd gathered for the opening night of her nonprofit, Reclaiming Tomorrow. The large space was filled with friends, colleagues, and women who had already been helped by the nonprofit's early initiatives. There were also several influential donors who had supported her vision from the start, eager to see how their contributions were making a real impact. Amara had always known how to command a room, but tonight was different. This wasn't about wealth, status, or appearances. It was about something much deeper. Tonight, she was stepping fully into her power, into a role she had long been prepared for, but hadn't realized until now. The journey had begun with heartbreak, but it had led her here, to a space where she could lift others, where her story would inspire hope and healing. The event was a celebration of women reclaiming their lives, their independence, and their futures. The walls of the ballroom were adorned with photographs of women who had overcome tremendous odds, single mothers who had rebuilt their careers, young entrepreneurs who had broken free from abusive relationships, survivors of domestic violence who were now thriving. Each photograph told a story of resilience, of strength, of transformation. The energy in the room felt palpable, the collective belief in Amara's mission resonating throughout. Amara glanced around at the faces in the crowd. There were women of all ages, backgrounds, and walks of life, each with their own story of struggle and triumph. They had come to celebrate the progress they had made, but also to acknowledge the work that still lay ahead. As the founder of Reclaiming Tomorrow, Amara knew that she wasn't just offering support. She was offering a new beginning. Her gaze landed on her first official hire, Marissa, the financial advisor who had joined the nonprofit a few months earlier. Marissa had faced her own hardships, and now she was helping other women navigate the financial challenges that came with starting over. Amara had built a team that not only shared her vision, but had lived through similar struggles, making their support all the more authentic. As Amara prepared to take the stage, her heart pounded in her chest. This was her moment. She had spent so much time behind the scenes supporting James, building his empire, but now she was the one leading a movement. She had dreamed of this, but the reality of it felt even more significant than she had ever imagined. The lights dimmed slightly, signaling that it was time for her speech. The murmurs in the room quieted, and all eyes were on her as she walked toward the podium. Amara's movements were graceful, but there was a newfound intensity in her presence, a fierce determination that came from the knowledge of what she had accomplished and what she still had to do. When she reached the microphone, she paused for a moment, taking in the faces before her. Her voice was steady but filled with warmth as she began. "Good evening, everyone," she said, her voice carrying effortlessly through the room. "Tonight isn't just about celebrating the opening of Reclaiming Tomorrow. Tonight is about celebrating each and every one of you. The women who have walked through difficult doors, who have made choices that were not easy but necessary, and who are now living proof that transformation is possible." A wave of applause swept through the room, but Amara held up a hand, signaling for quiet. She smiled softly, humbled by the response, but she had more to say. "When I first started this journey, I didn't know exactly where it would take me. I only knew that I had to stop hiding behind the shadows of others. I had to stop being the woman who silently supported from the sidelines and start being the woman who took control of her own future. She paused, glancing down at the podium, the weight of her words grounding her. I want you all to know that this nonprofit is not just mine. It belongs to all of us, to the women who have felt invisible, unheard, and underestimated. Reclaiming Tomorrow is about giving you the tools, the resources, and the strength to take back control of your life. The room was still, everyone hanging on her every word. Amara continued, the words flowing more easily now, filled with passion. This isn't just about recovery, it's about thriving. It's about remembering that you are worthy of everything you dream of. And it's about creating a community that supports each other, that uplifts each other, that celebrates each other. No one should ever feel alone in this journey. We are stronger together. The applause that followed was not only loud, but filled with emotion. Women in the crowd wiped tears from their eyes, moved by the sincerity of her words and the promise of what they could achieve together. Amara's message resonated deeply, not just with those who had already benefited from the nonprofit's work, but with those who had yet to take the first step toward rebuilding their lives. After the speech, Amara moved through the crowd, greeting guests, thanking donors, and listening to the stories of women whose lives had already been changed by Reclaiming Tomorrow. One woman shared how she had left an abusive relationship and was now working 2 jobs to support her children, while another talked about how the nonprofit's legal resources had helped her navigate a difficult divorce and start her own business. Each story added another layer to Amara's vision, and she felt a deep sense of fulfillment knowing that her mission was not only touching lives, but changing them. As the evening drew to a close, Amara stood at the back of the room, watching as the last guests filtered out. The exhaustion of the night began to settle in, but it was the kind of tiredness that felt earned, that came from doing something meaningful. She had built something from the ground up, something that was bigger than herself, bigger than her past. For the first time in years, Amara felt truly free. She had walked away from a life defined by someone else's choices and had stepped into a future she had created with her own hands. And as she looked out over the empty ballroom, she knew this was only the beginning. The work ahead was vast, but she was ready. She wasn't just reclaiming tomorrow. She was shaping it, one woman at a time. The city stretched out below as James Thornton sat alone in his sleek penthouse, his thoughts swirling in an endless cycle. The view of the skyline, which had once been his source of pride, now felt like a cruel reminder of all he had lost. He had spent years building his empire, convincing himself that success was the ultimate goal, that it was all he needed to feel whole. But the emptiness he felt now, after Amara's departure and the unraveling of everything he had once taken for granted, was far more profound than he had ever anticipated. The phone on the table vibrated, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen, but didn't pick it up. It was another call from his lawyer, another reminder of the impending divorce proceedings. Each call, each letter, felt like another chapter of his life being closed off, a book he had never realized he was writing until it was too late. His mind wandered back to the weeks after the gala, after Amara had left. His attempts at salvaging his business had failed. The investors who had once been eager to work with him were now reluctant, their trust in him shaken by the public humiliation and the whispers that followed. Friends had become distant, and colleagues, once his allies, had become quietly disapproving. His actions had alienated everyone around him, leaving him isolated and vulnerable. James had tried to push through it all, throwing himself into his work, making empty promises to turn things around. But nothing had worked. The same drive that had propelled him to success now felt like a burden, a relentless force pushing him toward a future that felt increasingly bleak. The more he tried to hold on to what was left, the more it slipped through his fingers. The empire he had built no longer seemed worth the cost. He stood up abruptly, his hands gripping the edge of the windowsill as he looked out at the city below. He remembered when he and Amara had first moved into this place, how proud they had been, how they had talked about their future, their shared dreams. He had been so consumed by ambition that he hadn't seen her slipping away until it was too late. James's phone buzzed again, this time more urgently. He sighed and finally answered, his voice hoarse as he spoke to the person on the other end. It was his lawyer, explaining the next steps in the divorce process. James barely listened, his mind clouded with regret and self-loathing. The life he had once built was now nothing more than a collection of hollow victories. The conversation ended, and James placed the phone down, his gaze once again drawn to the skyline. He had tried to convince himself that success would make him happy, that it would fill the void in his life, but now he understood the truth. Success without love, without meaningful relationships, was nothing. It was empty, a mirage that faded the closer you got to it. He thought of Amara, of her strength, her grace, and the quiet dignity she had shown throughout their entire marriage. She had been the foundation of everything he had accomplished, and yet he had taken her for granted, thinking he could replace her with superficial accomplishments and empty praise. What had he really built? After all, if the most important person in his life was gone? James sank into the armchair by the window, his face buried in his hands as the weight of his mistakes bore down on him. The emptiness was overwhelming, but it was also a wake-up call. It wasn't too late, he realized. He couldn't undo the past, but he could learn from it. He could stop pretending that his wealth and power were enough to define him. He could rebuild, not as the man who chased after fame and fortune, but as someone who understood the value of integrity, humility, and true connection. Amara had taught him that, without even meaning to, she had built him up, helped him succeed, and sacrificed so much for their life together. She had always believed in him, but now, James understood something he hadn't before. It wasn't just about achieving success. It was about the people you build it with and the person you were when you reached the top. He reached for his phone again, his fingers hesitating over the screen. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel like a failure. He felt like a man who had made mistakes and was now ready to own them. He knew what he had to do. A few weeks later, Amara stood at the podium, addressing a new group of women who had joined her nonprofit. The room was filled with hope, with laughter, and with the promise of new beginnings. Her vision for reclaiming tomorrow had grown beyond what she had imagined. More women were coming forward for support. More donors were stepping up to back her efforts. And Amara was finally seeing the impact of her work unfold before her eyes. She had come so far from the woman who had walked away from a life of false promises. She had reclaimed her power, her voice, and her future. But there was something more now, a peace she had never known before, a sense of fulfillment that couldn't be measured in dollars or accolades. She was building something real, something that would outlast her, something that would leave a legacy. As she finished her speech and stepped down from the podium, Amara's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the words. "I know I've done nothing to deserve it, but I need to apologize. I've spent so many years chasing the wrong things, but now I see what really matters. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I am asking for a chance to make things right. I hope you'll allow me to prove that I can change." It was from James. Amara stared at the message for a moment, her emotions conflicted. Part of her wanted to delete it, to move on with her life without the weight of the past. But another part of her, the part that had learned so much about forgiveness and growth, wondered if James had truly changed. She took a deep breath and set the phone down on the table. She wasn't ready to respond, not yet. But as she looked around the room, at the women whose lives had already begun to transform, she realized that she didn't need to rush. She had already built the life she wanted, and whatever came next, she would face it with strength, clarity, and a deep understanding of her worth. The door to the future was wide open, and Amara was ready to walk through it, no longer tethered to the past, but free to embrace whatever came next. The journey was hers to create, and it was only just beginning. I know you guys have already subscribed till now, but if you have not, do like, share, and subscribe.